Picture this, an empire spanning a sixth of the Earth's entire landmass. It commands millions of soldiers, possesses enough nuclear firepower to end the world several times over, and is so technologically advanced it literally launches the very first satellite into the cosmos. And then, poof, almost out of nowhere, it just crashes. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the absolute wildest geopolitical earthquakes of the 20th century, the incredibly rapid collapse of the Soviet Union. It's honestly the ultimate historical mystery. How does a global superpower just vanish overnight? I mean, in 1991, the USSR, a massive nation that entirely defined global geopolitics for decades, just dissolved into 15 separate countries in the blink of an eye. It wasn't conquered by an invading army. There wasn't some apocalyptic nuclear strike. It literally crumbled from the inside out. Let's dig into why. Okay, so if we take a step back, this fascinating contradiction starts to emerge. From the outside looking in, the USSR projected this terrifying, utterly impenetrable image to the globe. They had the cutting-edge nuclear missiles, they put Sputnik in orbit, they're funding proxy wars left and right. But if you look closer, the reality for everyday citizens was grim. It was just a hidden story of economic rot. So while the government is pouring billions into the space race, regular folks are standing in endless lines facing totally empty grocery store shelves, just trying to buy a loaf of bread. To really wrap our heads around this collapse, we have to start way back at the absolute height of their power. The year is 1946. Winston Churchill delivers a speech that perfectly sets the tone for the next 40 years. He famously declares, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Coming out of the ashes of World War II victorious, the Soviets were dead set on building this massive, impenetrable fortress, turning Eastern Europe into a giant buffer zone of satellite states. All right, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover the quest for global supremacy, the Cold War arms race, stagnation, and the Afghan drain, Gorbachev's desperate reforms, and lastly, the final sudden collapse. Let's see exactly how this intense geopolitical ambition ended up bankrupting an entire empire. Part 1. Quest for Global Supremacy. Right after World War II, the Soviet Union wasn't just looking to protect its borders. They were a superpower, utterly desperate to prove they were superior to the United States on the global stage. And honestly, early on, they were kind of winning. In 1957, they launched Sputnik, which sent the US into a total panic. Then in 61, Yuri Gagarin becomes the very first human in space. Geopolitically, they were relentlessly aggressive, funding communist parties worldwide and engaging in some seriously terrifying nuclear brinkmanship. Obviously, the biggest example being the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where Nikita Khrushchev parked nuclear weapons right in America's backyard. Moving on to Part 2, the Cold War arms race. Now, trying to compete toe-to-toe with a super wealthy capitalist powerhouse like the United States required a massive sacrifice when it came to domestic stability. Under Leonid Brezhnev's leadership, a mind-boggling 12% of the entire Soviet GDP was being funneled straight into their military and missile programs. They mobilized everything they had just to build an arsenal that could match the Americans. But here's the catch. When you're dumping all your national wealth into intercontinental ballistic missiles, you aren't spending it on housing or farming or basic consumer goods. And the crazy thing is, by the 1970s, they actually pulled it off. The USSR achieved nuclear parity with the United States. So on paper and from the outside, they looked completely untouchable. But keeping that colossal military-industrial complex running was bleeding the economy absolutely dry. This was a war driven by ideology and ego. The state essentially mortgaged its own economic future just to stockpile weapons, causing a severe, crushing drop in the quality of life for the average Soviet citizen. Which brings us to Part 3, Stagnation and the Afghan Drain. So now we enter the Brezhnev era, marking this huge shift from dynamic expansion into a pretty devastating period of economic paralysis. Historians actually call this the era of stagnation. The centralized planning of the government was just incredibly inefficient. Basically, to keep everyone compliant, the state made this unspoken deal. They turned a blind eye to a massive, illegal black market where things like Western blue jeans literally became a highly coveted currency, all in exchange for political loyalty. The country barely kept its head above water by exporting oil and gas, completely masking the fact that their manufacturing and agriculture were rotting from the inside out. And then came the really fatal strategic blunder. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government there. It was supposed to be a quick, easy intervention. Instead, it turns into a disastrous 10-year proxy war. It's actually a lot like the American experience in Vietnam. The Soviets get completely bogged down fighting Mujahideen forces who are being armed by the CIA. This war severely drained whatever fragile funds the government had left. But even worse, as young soldiers continually came back in body bags, grieving mothers started organizing. This fundamentally shifted public opinion against a state that was literally sacrificing its own youth. All right, part 4, Gorbachev's desperate reforms. So by 1985, the old guard running the Kremlin is literally dying off, and this younger, much more dynamic leader named Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. He looks around, realizes the whole system is failing, and tries to apply some radical CPR. He rolls out 2 massive, totally unexpected policies. The first is glasnost, which means openness. You have to remember, for decades, the Soviet people lived under strict censorship, constantly terrified of the secret police. Glasnost suddenly grants freedom of speech, allows the press to report freely, and even releases political prisoners. The goal was to build back trust and revitalize the country's spirit. His second big policy was perestroika, or restructuring. This essentially allowed little elements of private enterprise and foreign investment to seep into their super rigid communist economy. But more importantly, Gorbachev started moving away from that strict single-party monopoly, finally letting newer, younger voices in. But here's the crazy part. By doing that, he accidentally dismantled the exact authoritarian glue that had been holding those 15 vastly different republics together through sheer force. And that really reveals the ultimate irony of Gorbachev's good intentions. Once the citizens got a little taste of partial freedom, their hunger for it just skyrocketed. They looked across their borders at a prosperous West and finally realized just how far behind they'd fallen. So instead of saving the Soviet Union, Glasnost basically handed oppressed republics a megaphone to loudly demand their independence. You start seeing massive peaceful protests organizing, especially in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who, remember, had been forcibly annexed during World War II. And that leads us to part 5, the final sudden collapse. At this point, the momentum for freedom is basically an unstoppable avalanche crashing into a crumbling foundation. Let's trace how fast these dominoes fell. 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, a massive, literal symbol that the Iron Curtain is lifting. By February 1990, Gorbachev officially ends the Communist Party's monopoly on power. But the actual fatal fracture? That hits in August 1991. Communist hardliners, completely terrified of losing the empire, launch a coup. They place Gorbachev under house arrest and order the military into the streets. But the military flat out refuses to fire on their own people. The coup fails spectacularly, and it totally destroys whatever last shreds of authority the Communist Party had left. After that, the end comes unbelievably fast. On December 8, 1991, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus meet up and officially nullify the original 1922 treaty that created the USSR in the first place. By December 26, the Soviet Union is officially entirely dissolved. This massive, sprawling empire instantly fractures into 15 independent nations, with Russia remaining the largest piece of the puzzle. Decades of prioritizing global supremacy and a relentless arms race over the actual well-being of its people had left the entire state completely hollow. Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. We've just seen how the Soviet Union willingly sacrificed its own economy, its infrastructure, and the trust of its citizens, all for the sake of geopolitical dominance and keeping up in the Cold War arms race. So, if unchecked military ambition and stubborn ideology can destroy a massive global superpower from the inside out in just a matter of years, who is at risk today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.